Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over the online data as well as the IRL tournament data that we have pre-EUIC. This is that last look at what decks I think are going to be performing best and will be showing up at the EUIC based on what's been doing well so far. So let's have a look at my quick rundown of methodology. I've tried to make this as accurate as possible. As you guys know, I'm commentating, so I have no horse in the race. There's no reason for me to do any sort of manipulation. I'm trying to make it as accurate as I think I can make this data and sort of how I can portray this data. And I've done this by taking all of the Eastern Tournament event IRLs and have all their top 16s and one top 8 where there was a below 200 player tournament. It just so happened to be the only one where I didn't have the top 16 data anyway, but it seems to make sense that I would strip out data from decks that did less well in the sort of smaller tournaments, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to translate CP over to all of these tournaments. And I don't think there's an easy like one-to-one ratio of what's harder to win, etc. But what I've gone for is, for the Champions League tournaments and the other tournaments that are over 1,000 players, we're giving Internet CP for their top 16 placements, essentially, scaling up to the winner. For tournaments in person that were below 1,000 players, we're giving regional CP. I think that's pretty fair. Even though these are, best of one tournaments and whatnot, it's still a decent size tournament in all of these cases, but should be a step down from these Champions Leagues, which are multiple thousand players tournaments. And then we jump over to the online side of things, where I am only putting in tournaments with 64 players plus, but for those below 128 players, we're giving League Cup CP, and for those over 128 players, I'm giving State Championship CP. So this is actually sort of an in-between of regional and cups. It's something that the Trainer Hill data guys actually use, and I use this for my own sake because I think it's a good middle ground where I feel like there will be some of these online tournaments which shouldn't really equate to regional CP because it's only like 150 or so players. So I feel like this is a pretty good middle ground to try and give some sort of balance as to how important it is or how difficult it is to place in top cut of each of these respective types of events. I'm also adding in players 9 to 16, so the top 16 players for online events of over 200 players. In all the ones below 200 players, I'm only looking at the top 8 snapshots. So again, this is just to make sure that we're only looking at decks that have very strong records. And the further you go down in these lower person tournaments, the sort of less impressive the records get, especially because it's best of one as well. So it felt correct for me to only do top 8 placements, scaling down for events that were below 200 players in the online platform so far. Now, there's still more tournaments happening over the next few days, so there could still be time for decks to gain traction and whatnot. I think there have certainly been decks that have been picking up and dipping out of play already in this sort of 1.5 weeks or so of online tournaments. It's been really interesting to monitor just how quickly a meta develops thanks to the new online age and how visible all of that data is. So I do think it's sort of adapting day by day, essentially, the metagame, which is fascinating to see from a long-time player perspective. But this should be a good snapshot of what we've seen so far at the very least. So I've compiled all this data, and we're going to start off with top cut frequency. This is the amount of times a certain deck has made it into either top 8 or top 16 based on the size of the tournament that it was in. And we can see Lugia is actually way out in front. So on the left-hand side of your screen, I have separated it into individual deck. So that's why you're seeing different versions of Lost Zone, Box, and whatnot down here to various degrees of success. But I've tried to have as much differentiation as possible. So for those players who are scratching their head thinking, what's better, the DTE version of Mew or the Fusion build of Mew? Well, so far in online tournaments, it seems like the DTE version of Mew has literally had double the conversion rate into top cut. Well, possibly not conversion rate, because DTE was probably more successful. What I should say is twice as frequent as Fusion Mew in top cuts so far. Similarly for like Gardevoir builds, it seems like Gardevoir Mewtwo has really picked up in popularity recently and actually has had a decent number of top cuts, but it seemed like just based on taking the Japanese successful lists early on, the jelly builds of Gardevoir were much more popular earlier on and overall still have that higher claim to a higher number of top cut placements overall. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, I've done some lumping. I've lumped archetypes together. So Lost Box, this is the Turbo build, the Skyseal Stone build, the Charizard build, the Kyogre, and the Moltres builds. I've kept out Giratina and Goodra. I think these two are both different enough archetypes that I think it's still worth separating. But if you really wanted to add in that data, Lost Zone as like an engine, I suppose, would be by far the most top-cutting archetype and the most top-cutting engine in the game. And you can see as these Lost Boxes lump together, they do become more frequent. So the sort of Turbo and Skyseal have both done very well in terms of frequency of top cutting, very close together. Giratina quite close behind it as well, I would say. But you can see just how much Arceus decks sort of lump together, and also there's like a big divide in Gardevoir, almost like a split down the middle in terms of success rate, maybe a little bit more on the jelly side, but Gardevoir combined is also having a very decent number of top cuts. So to me it looks like Lost Box and Lugia, just in terms of cut frequency, are by far the best decks. Then it looks like Gardevoir, Arceus, and Mew are very close in that sort of next tier of decks. Giratina sort of in between, Giratina, Urshifu, sort of sitting around there, and then we have Goo and Miraidon sort of rounding out the sort of best decks, I would say, or best archetypes, best engines in general in terms of top cutting. And this is a frequency between both. This is just a combined frequency between IRL and the online tournaments. For CP, which is that sort of breakdown I was talking about earlier, I've got a slide for IRL as well as... Oh no, this is the separation, right? So IRL is on the left, online is on the right. A few interesting things here. The IRL seems to favour Skyseal Stone earlier on, as well as the Jelly Gardevoir, whereas online it seems like the wave is Turbo and Mewtwo. So I don't know if this is preference between regions, or if possibly there were a number of the IRL events, like certainly the Aichi was sort of that starting point, so people may have changed and adapted their list based on that sort of knee-jerk. It makes sense in my head why Turbo is being more successful more recently, because we know that Lost Box now is sort of like worth targeting, and Turbo build is oftentimes favoured in the mirror match just from the data. So it makes sense as to why Skyseal is possibly, or has possibly done better IRL so far, and then Turbo's doing better online. So just an interesting thing there. Almost tells a picture of how the format is already developing. A few other different nuances here. Fusion Mew has done far better in Eastern countries than in the online dataset so far. And you can pick the bones out of this as much as you want. I just wanted to give you that big flashpoint. But we can move on to the combined CP earned as well. And it actually looks like Lugia has overtaken Lost Box. And that's all Lost Box combined, actually. Lugia is now the most successful deck so far in the early format before we've even had a tournament. This is obviously theoretical CP, not actual CP earned. So for those of you hoping it wasn't going to be Lugia supremacy, I've got bad news for you. Lugia is doing very well in the opening stages. And yeah, Lost Box is just behind it. So again, similar to that sort of top cut frequency, we're seeing a very similar story here, with Lugia and Lost Box far and away the best two archetypes by the looks of things. Then we have Gardevoir, Mew, and Arceus kind of creeping in there as well, and then Lost Giratina, again sort of in that midway point, that sort of 0.5, you know, almost like a 1.5 sort of style deck. And if we're tiering it as like tier S here, tier 1 here, Lost Tina is like that 1.5, sort of looking in towards getting up to these other archetypes. Then we have Miraidon and Urshifu. Really has started to fall off in terms of CP, as in it's had decent frequency in terms of cuts, but it's only been in smaller online tournaments, which is far less prestigious than doing well in some of these larger IRL or even online events at the same time. Also, Lost Goo has been picking up a lot of plays in and placements in online tournaments, so it's starting to pick up that CP, but is still sort of lagging behind. So I think it's fair to sort of put these in a similar tier. And then unfortunately the Palkia Dialga and Control decks right now, they haven't had a lot of points behind them. I always like putting Control on here. It's only had one placement so far in an online tournament, and I think it was just a top 8, but it's always worth just tipping your cap to Control, because we know that it can come out at any point in the format once it's been sort of discovered and figured out by a certain select few players, essentially. But yeah, looking down, again, it's not too different from that frequency, really. It's just a different way of looking at the data. But this is theoretically how successful these different decks should be. The Skyseal Stone build slightly outperforming the Turbo overall in the combined totals. Just essentially going deeper into tournaments is, I suppose, the best way to look at this, because they had a very similar frequency in terms of top cut ratio. Lost Tina actually jumps a little bit higher than the Guardi as well, so maybe that's an indication that it's doing well and going deeper into tournaments. The Mews are actually quite close to one another, so there have been some higher placing Mews in the larger scale in-person tournaments, which is where the CP is weighted towards. So it's up to you whether or not you sort of take that into account. Arceus decks as well, just as that lumping is really interesting to me that it's held out so well. I think there has been this narrative that like Arceus isn't good enough anymore, but that's definitely like not the case. It's like definitely good enough, and it's seeing success in all sorts of different ways. So it's still just in general a consistent, strong card that you can build your deck around. And, you know, just looking down this list, we see like a Pure Pika, we see a Duraludon that was also playing Alolan Vulpix, we got an Aerodactyl Vulpix, we got Goodra, we got Sylveon Box. I didn't know whether to put this alongside Urshifu or not, because honestly it's just a ton of Rapid Strike cards. But again, Arceus is the acceleration and the consistency part of this. We have that Gallade build, which is trying to be, you know, recreating that Inteleon style vibe with like a straight Arceus approach. And then we go up to the more sort of known ones, the Arctina Pika, as well as the just straight Arctina, which I have separated as well. It seems like most of the straight Arctinas are doing better than Arctina Pika. But I definitely think it's worth looking at Arctina Pika, because in theory it should improve like your Lugia matchup. And as the highest point earner so far, I think it's worthwhile possibly teching your deck to have a good time into that, which sort of brings me on to the most recent Trainer Hill data, actually. One last look at this before we go into the EUIC. I'm actually leaving tomorrow to get there nice and early to do some prep and whatnot in London. And I really wanted to target Lugia and Lost Box, because these are what we would expect, because they are the most successful so far, to be the most popular, just makes sense, or to at least be most prepared for, I suppose is another way of thinking about this. And just looking at how these decks are struggling in the game right now. So Lost Zone Box struggles into Arceus Giratina right now. It struggles into Goodra. It struggles into Urshi Intel, although it feels like Urshi Intel is a very risky play because it has a horrific time into Lugia, and then it has a slightly awkward time into Lugia. Whereas Lugia's matchup spread is actually crazy based on the online data. Now, like, it has been very successful, and I'm sure there are ways that people are coming up with beating Lugia, even just some cheeky tech inclusions right now. There has been murmurings of certain things going around of just how you can sort of sweep the rug away from Lugia just based on how they're being built right now. And if Lugia's unprepared for those techs, they can just lose and sort of be the outlier to these percentage points. But right now, there's only, 3 decks that have a below 50, that Lugia has a below 50-50 into. 2 of them are Gardevoir based, so that could be a possible reason to want to play Gardevoir, especially the Mewtwo variant, which has a very decent time into Lost Zone, like still favored for Lost Zone, but nowhere near as much as the Jelly Guardies that we've seen previously. And then it's also weak into Goodra. So there's one deck that targets, in theory, the Lost Zone boxes that we've seen and the Lugia deck that we've seen, and that's Lost Zone Goodra. So if you're stuck on a deck to play, Lost Zone Goodra, in theory, is very good into the 2 best decks in format. And if you just look at the Lost Zone Goo, that's weak to Guardi Mewtwo, apparently, and Giratina, as well as, well, Intel Urshi's still a little bit dicey, and the Mew is dicey, but nowhere near as dicey as I thought, actually. I've seen percentage points of this be, like, way, way lower before, so that's a little bit surprising to me, actually. So my metagame pick, if you're completely lost, is Lost Zone Goodra, or just play Lost Zone Box of your favorite variant, or Lugia. I think those 3 are the smartest choices going into the tournament. If you have cracked Guardi Mewtwo and made it consistent enough for yourself, that's completely fine. And I also think Arc variants are also just like relatively safe. They put people through the ringer of just judging, pathing them, and making sure that you're getting star buff online, so just get into the game. So those are the sort of decks that I think are the safest and wisest choices going into this tournament. Now, that being said, I've been to the EUIC many times, I've commentated it for years, and there's always things that can be pitfalls and traps, and brand new archetypes can burst onto the scene, and secret tech cards can come in clutch. We've seen it a few times over the years, so take it with a pinch of salt. Let me know what you guys thought about this data rundown. I'm sure at this point you can just start looking at the Trainer Hill data more and more, and I don't need to really keep up this spreadsheet or whatnot, because we'll start having in-person tournament results to start basing our testing off of and techs off of. But I really think going into a new format, all of this research and all of this testing can really pole vault you into much higher success than once we start getting a more and more discovered format where pretty much everyone has experience into every matchup. So it really does make sense to put all your time into the beginning of a meta. That's where you can make absolute huge gains in terms of championship points and earnings and whatnot. This is the best time to be focusing in on the tournaments. And for me, you know, I have no stress, I have no biases, I'm not having to worry about this in terms of myself, I'm just the researcher here, I'm just trying to throw out that information for everyone, because again, I have no sort of stake in this tournament, I'm just happy to watch everyone else duke it out. Let me know your thoughts down below, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for another video. Cheers.